COVID-19, it's a virus which devastated the regular life time of every individual, and over this specifically to look at the trans and the queer life making in South Asia. So mainly you are going to discuss about your area of research is South Asia, and if you look at that in South Asia itself, we could get different types of actually interventions, or this whole community, they face the problems where there are a lot of similarities, where there are a lot of dissimilarities also. And if you look at the interventions, there are, if you look at United Nations certain announcement during that period of time, that they have actually given one very strong recognition to a Pakistani group who actually worked quite hard with respect to this queer individual, queer population in large quantity. And in India also several NGOs, they worked on them, but in general what we know that they really face quite a bit of problems which are terrible for their life. And so I don't want to keep you all waiting, but I think the last line which I'm missing in this title, the thinking regionally and geopolitics, alter geopolitics. So this is something which is I found that as a student of sociology or whatever disciplines you are here, it's very important that this geopolitics, how actually it has got an impact on the whole thing. So I'm sure Dr. Dasgupta will definitely share with you about his experience, but it will be much more interesting if listening to him you can have whatever questions in your mind to share those questions with him and make it a little bit of more interactive so that you can get the vibes of this particular seminar. So I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions in your mind. Feel free to ask the questions, and that is only going to make this effort by the faculty members of the Department of Sociology a successful one. These few words, thanking all of you, and hope you are going to ask questions to Dr. Dasgupta. Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I would like to request our Dean, sir, to kindly say a few words.
Let's sit here and see. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, Professor Dasgupta, esteemed guests, faculty members, dear students. I have not much of an understanding of the topic, to be honest. One is not supposed to know everything about the sun. But I can share this, that my first research, for which I wrote an MPhil, was on androgyny. And this came about, the idea of the narrature came about when I was visiting the Ajanta Ellora caves, and the state-appointed guide pointed out the figure of Buddha breaking at the waist, holding a flower, the lotus. And he pointed out and said, what a bad depiction of a noble, of a warrior. Here is the son of a prince who doesn't have a sword in his hand. And it was a very intriguing comment. And when I went back to my university, I was in JNU in those days, I spoke to my supervisor, Patricia Uberoy, and I told Pat that this is what I heard. And she said, that's very interesting. Why don't we start looking at this very closely? And that's triggered off my thesis on androgyny. I spent some time talking to Gina Das and Jeffrey Uberoy and others, and we decided that yes, it's a matter worth pursuing. Most importantly, just like when Professor Chattopadhyay asked whether any of you know about queer and there was a definite silence, people asked me what this androgyny thing is all about, because there was a deafening silence in the mid-80s and the late 80s when it came to understanding alternate sexuality. One of the things that sociologists do, which others I think do not do, is foolishly venture into those areas from where angels would flee. And it is the onerous task of the sociologist to break taboos. I'm very happy that so many people have gathered here to listen to alternate sexualities. But we have also keep in mind that sexuality is not only alternative or alternates, but is also intersectional. Not only do you have an LGBTQ+, but you also have an LGBTQ+ in terms of race, and I'm quite sure that Dr. Dasgupta will appreciate that living in the United States. People of color, as they say, in terms of caste, in terms of class, and of course access to social goods, including education, health, etc., etc. So what we're talking about is that we are talking about marginal people. And what I suppose, I am only guessing, that what the presentation would be is to say how marginal people were further marginalized when the COVID-19 came around. We are in the process of trying to understand the idea of the marginal from different perspectives, and not necessarily economic. The perspective of the economic marginal has always been there. That's as old as the Industrial Revolution. But what we are trying to do in post-modern, post-colonial times is that to understand the idea of marginality from various sectors, including the idea of gender and sexuality, and say that people who are marginalized by sexuality and gender are at an equal disadvantage as those who are marginalized by economics. And I think that we have a very interesting session ahead of us. I would not take much of your time. I'm very glad that Dr. Dasgupta has come over and has decided to spend some time with us. I'm quite sure that will be very enlightening. I would now request Professor Dasgupta to take over and do his presentation. And I hope students interact with you and that they feel a little more enlightened than they were before you started.
Thank you so much. I'm going to sit and speak from here.
Yes.
I'm sure everybody can hear me.
Yes.
I've been in many protests, so গলা ছাড়তে শিখেছিলাম তো গলা না ছাড়লে কোনো কাজ হয় না. So I'm going to speak from here. Thank you so much to SEMA, to the Sociology Department, to the Dean, and to your Vice Chancellor for welcoming me here today. I'm going to share, this is new work that has been happening over the past 2 or 3 years. I'm going to share glimpses from my forthcoming, and I have a copy that I'll circulate. This is a draft, which I can share. It's a graphic novel that will be coming out from this research, collaboratively done with community activists. So I have Anurag Moitri, dear friend, collaborator, activist, NGO worker. Anurag, you want to say a few words about yourself and this? Okay. Also poet and celebrated author. Anurag is here with me in the light of collaborations and collaborative research. So when I talk about my method, you will hear how feminist collaborative ethnography is an important model for knowledge production. We question the subject-object division. So one place we might differ with sociologists, although my first love is sociology, my bachelor's is in sociology from Presidency College, and I'll come back to what your dean just said. It's very important. How my journey began was from a sociology class with Professor Prashantu Roy, and PR in his indelible way had taught us a foundation of sociological thought is intellectual unrespectability. Have you heard this term? Intellectual unrespectability. It's a substantive foundation of sociological thought. That is, we do not judge. We study even that which is a taboo. We actually question, why is it a taboo? Who is marginalized by such taboo? Who gains by such a taboo? So, where the middle class intellectual respectable politics might not go, an ethical sociologist will go to do that work, right? So my journey began from there, and I took up scholar activism. I mean, there was nothing as queer or gender studies in 1993 in Kolkata. So you mentioned NAS Foundation. I actually co-founded NAS Foundation in Kolkata in 1993. That was the first HIV/AIDS and sexual health prevention program for men who have sex with men, hijras and kotis in Kolkata. While I was a third-year student in Presidency College, something that I will not necessarily encourage because it meant I missed a lot of classes, and I missed my first class by a few points. But I want to highlight how any research has to happen. I think I'm good without this, don't worry. Oh, they're recording. Okay. Is this okay? So I wanted to highlight how sociological research for me was very much involved with activism. An activism that was born out of the necessity of my everyday life. Because nobody was doing work or talking about my community or my needs, right? So যখন তোমার কমিউনিটির জন্য কিছু থাকে না, তখন দুটো উপায় আছে। একটা হচ্ছে তুমি চুপচাপ মাথা গুঁজে দিন কাটাবে, আর একটা হচ্ছে রাস্তায় রুখে দাঁড়াবে। So, so we decided that it was enough is enough, that we need not be silent. And I was part of the first Histories of Alternate Sexualities conference in South Asia, and we opened NAS Foundation in Kolkata, and NAS originally started from the UK, and now also has branches in Pakistan, in Bangladesh as well. Eventually NAS in Bangladesh became Bondhu Welfare Society, who's doing very important work and are actually right now doing life-saving work with trans and queer communities after the revolution in Bangladesh. So I want to highlight this by saying that sociology is a very dynamic, exciting discipline. Have fun with it, run with it, change the world with it, because sociology absolutely transformed how I could imagine society. মানে সোশ্যালজি পড়ার পরে এখন কোনো বেসিক একটা সিনেমাকেও যে সিনেমা হিসেবে দেখতে পারি না। I start analyzing social relations underneath it, right? So having said that, I want to talk about, let me come back to this project. Before I jump into talking about specifically COVID-19 and why I came to doing trans queer work around COVID-19, I want to talk, oh good, it goes through. I want to talk briefly about where I was in 2018-2019. So in 2018-2019, I had a Social Science Research Council grant, SSRC. You can see the logo of it. As a good American academic, I have to advertise the people who give my paycheck. So as part of the Inter-Asia program, I was doing research along the Indo-Nepal, Indo-Bangladesh border. And in the Indo-Nepal border, I was working around Simara, Rotahat, Hetauda, which is around the Bihar-Raxaul border. And the reason is, 2017, 18, 19 was a very exciting time for transgender recognition in South Asia. Most countries, Pakistan was the first in 2018 that passed a comprehensive transgender Bill of Rights legislation, right? And to pass any legislation in Pakistan, the parliament, when they pass a bill, it has to go to the Council for Islamic Culture, CIC. They have to review the bill in order to ensure that it represents the ethos of Pakistan. And when the bill came to the council said, oh, we are not really familiar around Hijra and Kinnar issues. So we invited Hijra and Kinnar activists who sat down with the Maulvis and explained to them from hadiths and the Quran how being trans, how being Hijra or Kinnar is part of the religion. That kind of deep work, to sit down with your Islamic leader, to pass one of the most comprehensive legislation happens in Pakistan in 2018, but it's actually not too new. Let me see, maybe I should just go back here. So there's a longer history here. Around 2009 in Pakistan, the Supreme Court passed a judgment about Nadra, which is their national ID, and said that male, female, or other must be recognized, and that every person in Pakistan has the right to have either male, female, or other. Now, 2007 in Nepal was the first South Asian country when they were rewriting their constitution, which I hope something like that would happen in Bangladesh. When Nepal was rewriting their constitution, they actually included LGBTQ rights as part of the constitution. So constitutionally enshrined LGBTQ rights. And at that time, Sunil Babu Pant and Blue Diamond Society actually went to the Supreme Court of Nepal and sued Nepal police over violence faced by trans communities in the hands of Nepali police. And that case is where the Supreme Court gave a judgment that became a precedent-setting case for Nepal, that the Constitution now includes LGBTQ rights. So that is 2007, 2009, and we know it is between 2017, 2018. In India, we see decriminalization of sodomy. The anti-sodomy provisions of 377 is written down, and we see in between 2017 and 2019, Parliament had been deliberating on transgender Bill of Rights. There were many problematic elements on it, but they settled on the activist communities pushed the transgender Bill of Rights. There were criminalizing provisions, criminalizing begging. There were many other problems. But I want to give this context in India that we get a transgender Bill of Rights in India legally in 2019, and as in 2014 is when we have a Supreme Court judgment. In Bangladesh also between 2014 and 2017, the Bangladeshi legal registrar includes Hijra as a category for national identity. All well and good. That's wonderful. But then what becomes the question is, how do I know you are a Hijra? How do I know you are a trans person? When we ask for recognition, the state can say, yes, great, I give you recognition, but I need terms of this recognition. So with recognition comes newer forms of regulation. So when we ask for rights, we actually open up our lives for further examination by the state, which has its pros and cons.
So with recognition came very problematic forms of state examinations. In Bangladesh, if you claim you are Hijra and you would want your ID card, there were, we don't know what will happen now, but there were reservations in jobs, in government sector, in education for Hijra communities. The state would send a medical examiner to your house. And the medical examiners came thinking Hijra, which is actually a cultural community, it's not a biological condition, they conflated being Hijra with being intersex. And often most applications were rejected. In the case of India, and Anurag can talk a little bit more when we go into the portion, in the case of India, the state initially also set up a medical examination board. And even though our Supreme Court in 2014, the Supreme Court judgment says that the state must affirm the rights of every Indian citizen based on self-perception, self-affirmation. So if I consider myself as trans, if I consider myself as a woman, that is my right to get my identity. Whereas when the law is passed, the state mandates certain kinds of medical examination. So you have to show proof of gender dysphoria or visiting a psychiatrist, a letter, medical exam of body. These are very invasive procedures that the trans community pushed back upon. And we have settled on, it's still self-affirmation again, right? It's self-determination of gender identity. So when I was studying changes, that's all well and good, changes in law is amazing. But what does that mean for every day? As a geographer and a sociologist, I have to ask, what does the law mean in an everyday? Well and good that there is recognition, but are my friends getting their identity cards? What is the experience at the Aadhaar card office? Does the local Aadhaar card officer understand changes in legislation? Does changes in legislation actually create administrative procedures that are being operationalized or not? Another very important aspect of the changes in legal recognition in the context of India was that since we have reservations on the basis of being trans, there has been made reservations in jobs or in academic institutions. But if you were intersecting, if you were a Dalit trans person, you could either have to file as a Dalit person or as a trans person. What it does is it equated a Brahmin trans person and a Dalit trans person's oppression to be the same kind of oppression. There was no nuance for understanding the Dalit experience, right? So as a dominant caste, historically dominant caste person, tomorrow if I start claiming 10% reservation or whatever percentage of reservation as trans over a Dalit person, for me that is, unethical because our oppressions don't match up. The economic oppression of a dominant caste person versus a Dalit person doesn't match up. So these were some classic collusions of categories that frame the recognition of trans identities. I was working at the borders because I was interested in, as a scholar of migration, I was interested in migratory trans communities, trans labor migration. And the thing is, when you do research in Nepal or in Sri Lanka, the first thing I was told was we don't have hijras in Nepal. Hijra is a very Pakistan, India, Bangladesh category and community. So there are my Metis or my Thais, and the Metis women from Nepal, because India and Nepal has an open border, would come into Bihar up until Punjab, be part of Hijra Gharanas, or they would do Sada dancing or Londa dancing as migrant laborers and then go back. That was a form of income for many Metis women in Nepal. There was extreme amounts of violence that migrant workers, trans migrant workers would face in my research that was coming up. And along the Indo-Bangladesh border, you know, it's very interesting. You could have a guru in Dhaka and you could have their disciples in Kolkata. Or you could have a guru staying in Noapara and their disciples are in other parts of Bangladesh. And many trans community members, especially Hijra gurus and Hijra chillas, would go back and forth. And there are ways that are, you know, sometimes performing sexual favors for a border security force, sometimes involved in trafficking, sometimes simply clapping and shaming the border security force. You can go back and forth between the border. So this experience of an open border and a closed border for me is a very trans-regional geography. While South Asia has been divided off into contiguous nation states, there are continuities between the nation states. And so I was interested in understanding how trans community, the term transgender itself is a trans-regional term. So Hijra, Metis, Koti, Kinnar, these are terms that are relevant in most of the nation states. While religious practices might be different or syncretic in certain Hijra Gharanas, there are regional identities that frame trans communities. So for me, the trans region is the method for understanding trans identities in South Asia. So transing borders is about understanding that borders are porous, that borders are therefore meant to be crossed. So the borders of gender are also porous. This idea that male and female is a binary and there exists a border between us is a porous border. And people can cross and often cross between them. And there are diverse cultures, multiple identities that thrive in between these categories, just like in between the border regions of the nation state. So that brought me to, I just want to quickly highlight about how to think about South Asia. So I take a lot from scholars in Inter-Asia studies to think about South Asia as a concept and a method. That not to think about Asia or South Asia merely as contiguous category. Bangladeshi revolution hotche, what is the first response of the Indian military is that we have to militarize the border in order to sort of deal with potentially people storming the Indian border. Why? Because our borders are porous. People's lives are across borders. And there are so many continuities in culture and tradition in South Asia. So the global and regional constitution of nations, right? The very fact that India is, we can think of ourselves as a nation state is always in relationship with India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bhutan. Like who we are, what we do in the region makes us what we are. So what India is always in relationship with other nation states. I am India because I'm not Pakistan or Bangladesh, right? So how do I know I'm in India? Because I'm not in Pakistan and Bangladesh. How do I know this is India? Oh, this is a supposedly secular democracy, right? The other was a secular fascism. So study of Asian thought as inter-Asian space that includes mobility, disaggregation, reaggregation, connection, circulation, partial societies, trans-regional axes, intermediate scale, and outside-in analysis. So Amuji, transing region and trans identities bolam, it is very important to think about the region as a trans region. Where do you even study? How do you want to study a region? How do you want to set a scale? Do you want to study at the list at the level of the district, or do you want to study at the level of the inter-district? Do you want to study at the level of 3 districts, hence a region, or do you want to study at the level of 1 city, but the city as a region? So it's very important to think regionally, because that allows us to see the multiplicities and the porosities of borders. So thinking about inter-Asia as a fluid space, rather than territorially tightly bound nation state, as a fluid space, which is very important, because when we talk about transing gender, we talk about gender fluidity, right? So in some sense, thinking about the gaps and fissures between national borders and borders of the binary. Okay. So now I come to, you can say, Debanuj, like, how do you bring this theory of thinking about borders with COVID-19? And what has queer got to do with that? So first, following Michel Foucault, I want to talk about biopower. Michel Foucault, French continental philosopher, many of you might have read or heard his name, in his theory of biopower, says around 18th and 19th century in Europe, there was a form of power that was taking hold, and he names it biopower. Why? Because we were inventing, biology was making, anatomological sciences was being formed, biological understanding of the human body, categories, ways of dealing with disease, making our life quality better and longer, and fighting like the bubonic plague, having penicillin as a drug. These forms of invention actually made our life better, and it forms a kind of power that he will argue is biopower. In the case of COVID-19, you can see it very, very clearly, right? So when COVID-19 started happening, we did not know how the hell to deal with this, right? No nation state clearly knew what to deal with it. Somebody asked you to come out and clang pots and pans. Somebody closed their door, airports. So, we did not really know how to manage this disease. So diseases take a global scale. In this case, a pandemic. Why a pandemic? It's a global scale. When diseases take a global scale, the management of that disease then holds a lot of power over me. Somebody told us not to leave the house. So most of us did not leave the house except for emergencies. So think about how much power is in that public health statement. Do not leave the house. Stay home, stay safe. Think about when the vaccine was invented, we quickly put ourselves, our bodies, we trusted our public servants, and we put our bodies under medical gaze and took in the vial into our body. And this is precisely what Michel Foucault will say is biopower, is that a form of power other than sovereign power. Sovereign is the nation state. Our earlier sovereign was the king. The king could have chopped your head. In this case, it's the nation state. What can a nation state do? The nation state, how does a nation state exert its power over its population? You can either stay or go. If you're too bad, I will put you to death, right? Whereas biopower is very nebulous. We actually cooperate sometimes with biopower because it makes our life longer. It makes us live better. So any form of medical, pharmacological intervention, biotechnological inventions form a kind of power-knowledge nexus that grips over us. So this form of biopower was very important for me to understand because when COVID-19 was happening, most governments were like, we don't know how the hell to deal with this. And so that is what typically viruses will do. They will come as an attack and then they will tell the sovereign power, the nation state, hey man, you don't know how to deal with this. And then biopower and biopolitical establishments, let's say in this case pharmaceutical industries that were working on invention of vaccines, let's say the United Nations, they will all come along and create a form of arrangements that becomes biopower. So for this moment for me became a very important moment to think about biopower and sovereign power. And I'll tell you why. Because I was stuck in the United States, and our then President Donald Trump talked about initially the response to COVID-19 was that COVID was coming from China, that it's somehow a Chinese disease. A narrative that we see taken up also in the United States and also in India, and we see huge amounts of anti-Sino racism taking form in the US as well as in India. Now, geopolitically speaking, 2019-2020 is an era where there's an intensity of geopolitical conflicts playing out. Around 2019-2020, we see conflicts over Ladakh between India and China and Nepal. We are constantly responding to the growth of China and Chinese power, soft power in the region. And so this fear of China pushes India towards cooperating with Russia and the US. And India has always been quite amazing actually in diplomatically playing between these two powers, right? So this form of geopolitics becomes very important because if you look at the map of Kashmir, and if I go back to the community where I was, where did I start? Let me go back here. These were my trans and queer communities I was working with. They were all along, they were constantly, this whole region is framed by the geopolitics of India, Russia, China, and Pakistan, right? And so who gets to come in or not? What kinds of border security forces is there? Who gets to move between Bangladesh or who gets to move in the northeast, between Manipur and Assam is all regulated. This traffic was very heavily regulated by this geopolitics. So COVID-19 happens, there is and as well as simultaneously there is this intense nation-state geopolitics going on, and my mother falls ill. So I had to come to India in one of those expatriate flights, and I arrive in Kolkata. My mother was unwell, not related to COVID, but something else. And, it was a very intense moment where, I had to quarantine for 10 days. I had to test myself. Back then, testing was not so big, or it wasn't available so easily. And then I end up in Kolkata, and I have a conversation with Maitreyi. And in our conversation, I have been observing the kind of relief that was being done during COVID-19. But what was important for me to understand and talk about is this idea that stay home, stay safe. The home as a safe space is the first thing that a queer studies scholar will question. Stay home, stay safe. Who is safe at home? One has to ask this question. If you are a queer person, if you are a trans person, home, the domestic, often might not be your safe place. If you are a survivor of domestic abuse, then for a woman, staying home, captive with your abuser, is not the safe space. So there were lots of reports of gender abuse during COVID-19. There's research that shows how men and women, cis men and women, married men and women, reverted to traditional gender roles in the domestic space, that working women were both working from home as well as engaging in domestic work, that they had to revert to the role of caregiver while the COVID-19 was happening, right? My father had once jokingly said on the phone, "হ্যাঁ আমি তো এখন কাজের মাসে হয়ে গেছি, আমি বাসন ধুচ্ছি।" I said, "আমি রোজ বাসন ধুই আমার এখানে, আমার কোনো কাজের মাসে নেই আমেরিকাতে, আমি নিজেই আমার বাসন ধুই, তো খুব ভালো, এমন কিছু ডিফিকাল্ট কাজ নয় ওটা।" So to which he said, "হ্যাঁ তোমাদের তো ওয়াশিং মেশিন আছে, আমাদের তো নেই." So it doesn't matter, it's not a massive task. Anyhow, so the home, stay safe, this form of re-spatialization that we had to engage with was a form of spatial restriction, right? Berote parbe na. So first spatial restriction. Second spatial restriction was, of course, in terms of long distance travel and journey, and I'll come to that later. So for me, this spatial restriction was very dangerous because trans communities and queer communities, we thrive on being with each other, not necessarily with our biological families in the domestic space. Many people, carry their makeup and sari in their bag and come to a friend's house and put on their makeup and wear their sari or pants and gets to experience their true gender identity only with each other, right? So, and many people were reporting on the internet, they were reporting to us that they had, when they were going back to their houses, they were facing violence, right? That their houses were not necessarily accepting them. One of these stories, so in this image you see Joya Shikhtar from Shamporke Naya Setu. Joya Shikhtar is working with Shamporke Naya Setu in Dhaka. And one of the things that Joya reported to me was that people who were working in Bombay or New Delhi, Bangladeshi workers trans workers would write to her and say, "Appa ami ashchi," and they would come, and we'll talk about the journey, they would assemble a new geography to get to Dhaka, and when they got there, they would stay for a few days at Joyadi's house, had to cut their hair, wear pants, men's clothes, and go back home. And Joyadi said even when they went back, many of them were not accepted. People did not accept them in their communities. And so some of them came back with Joyadi, some of them went to Hijra communities. So the future became very uncertain. The other very important thing that happened that Joyadi and I worked on was the question of housing. That many people lost their livelihoods. So if you were part of Hijra Gharana, you were doing challa, you were on the street. And that is another form of spatial restriction. There was no street, no longer challa left. If you were working in a beauty parlor, in the service industry, which many trans women work as, there was no work left. People could not pay rent for their houses, right? And Joyadi had assembled a set of, did relief work. We raised money for Joyappa, and she assembled relief supplies, and at that moment put her life at risk and traveled around distributing. I think I have some images of the supplies. So this was from Joyadi's page. This is some of the food and parathas and rice that they were relief that Joyadi was distributing. And this is in 2020 during the first lockdown. And I was asking Joyadi, how is it that you know where to go in Dhaka city? You know, she was just on a rickshaw, paying the rickshaw person, putting her life and her relief workers' lives at risk. And Unura can talk about similar work that happened in Kolkata. And she told me that, I know. I drew a map of Dhaka for her, and she told me by police stations, she knew Dhaka neighborhoods, and she told me exactly how many trans women were living in trans men were living in these different parts of the city. So this form of intuitive geography for me was very important. It is not a kind of map that we find in a political map or a map that is created for regular purposes. This is an intuitive map that a subject who has been written out of the map, has been written out of the city, knows from their own survival skill. So this form of map, this form of on-the-ground mapping was very important and was mobilized in order to do relief work during that period, right? So, hop, skip and jump, I arrive in Kolkata, and the world as I knew, or the Kolkata as I knew, had very much changed. You know, people were not on the streets as much. We had to wear masks, and I was having a conversation with Anurag, and may I say what you had said? I had asked Anurag কেমন আছিস, and she told me কতদিনে রিলিফের চালের পোকা বেঁচে থাকবো. And this conversation sort of, pointed to me exactly how the precarity of trans lives were during COVID-19. And we all know that first year there was so much conversation about migrant workers. There was even a pujo pandal that had migrant workers, right? But nobody talked about trans migrant workers. So there was a remapping of the gender binary happening even onto the pandemic. I want to add a little bit about that period and the kind of relief or the kind of stories you were facing. You finish it? No, go ahead. This is যেটা প্রথম একটু আমি আসলে একটু বলবো, তারপর ওখান থেকে মানুষটা যে এখানে যারা আছেন আজকে পার্টিসিপেন্ট যারা আছেন, তো ট্রান্স বলতে তোমরা আপনারা ট্রান্স শব্দটা মোটামুটি সবাই শুনেছেন যারা, তো সেই জায়গায় বাবা আমি ফার্স্টে একটা মানুষ হয়ে করছি যে ভোট লাভ চেতন। এই যে ভোট লাভ চেতন একটা বাচ্চা জন্মানোর পর এই ট্রান্স আলোচনা শব্দটা তো আমার পরে এসেছে। আমরা খুব ছোটবেলা থেকে ট্রান্সফর্মিং মাইসেলফ এই জাপানের মধ্যে দিয়ে যখন আমরা বুঝতে পারছি যে আমার শরীরের একটা ইনডিফারেন্স বা একটা বৈপরীত্য আছে খুব ছোটবেলা থেকে, সেই জায়গায় দাঁড়িয়ে প্রথমে একটা আত্মবিদ্রোহ তৈরি হয়, প্রথমে নিজের শরীর বিদ্রোহ তৈরি হয়, তারপর ইমিডিয়েট ফ্যামিলি, নতুন ফ্যামিলি, সমাজ, পরিবার, পুরো এটা চলে। তখন এই যে ভোট লাভ চেতন যে কনফার্মিস্টিক যে রাস্তাটা নেওয়ার কথা ছিল, এই পেট্রিয়ার্কাল হেজেমনি, ওই প্রোডাক্টিভ রাস্তা যেখানে ইনস্টিটিউশনাল সমস্ত রকম টুলস এবং টুলস অফ অপারেশনস গুলো রয়েছে, সেই রাস্তাটা ট্রান্স মানুষরা নিয়ে নেয়। কোন রাস্তাটা নিয়ে এমন একটা রাস্তা যেটা প্রতিষ্ঠানকে, ইনস্টিটিউশনকে প্রতিটা মুহূর্তে ভাঙতে যাচ্ছে, কারণ ট্রান্স রিলেশনস আর নন প্রোক্রিয়েটিভ, যেখানে ডাইরেক্টলি ফ্রম দ্য ক্যাপিটাল এবং শিশু বা ফ্রান্সের সঙ্গে পুঁজিবাদের যে সহাবস্থান অ্যাসোসিয়েশন, তো প্রতিটা মুহূর্তে সেখানে ফ্রান্সকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করা হচ্ছে বা ক্যাপিটালিজমকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করা হচ্ছে। তো প্রতিটা সময় কমেন্ট করলেন, যিনি বললেন সবাইকে যে আমি একজন রূপান্তরকারী মানুষ, সেই বিসংগতিতার যে পথ, সেই যে আমি বলছিলাম বিসংগতিতার সবপথে আমি আবার বলছি যে পেছনে যে পথ, তিনি যে পথটা বাঁচলেন, কিন্তু তিনি ক্ষমতাহীন হইবেন একজন ফ্রান্স মানুষ, তিনি মরণ পারবে স্যানিটার্সে জন্মেছেন বা পঞ্চমতলা বস্তিতে জন্মেছেন, তিনি হ্যাজ নো জেন্ডার, নো কাস্ট, নো ক্লাস, যন্ত্রণার কোনো লিঙ্গ হয়নি। তো কারণ একজন সিস মহিলা, যে একটু আগে যেটা বলছেন, আমরা অনেকেই বলছি যে ট্রান্স নাম কিন্তু হিজড়া নয়। এই যে ট্রান্সকে হিজড়া বলে তৈরি করে দেওয়া হয়, হিজড়া কিন্তু কোনো জেন্ডার আইডেন্টিটি নয়, এটা একটা পরম্পরা, যেমন মাধুকরী পেশা, ডাক্তার, প্রফেসর, সায়েন্টিস্ট, সেরকমই রিক্সা চালক, রান্নার কাজ করেন গৃহ শ্রমিক, সেরকমই হিজড়া একটি পেশা বা পরম্পরা, সেখানে একটি গুরু শিষ্যর একটা লেগেসি আছে। ট্রান্স কিন্তু একটা জেন্ডার আইডেন্টিটি। এবার ট্রান্স বহু মানুষরা এবার প্রশ্ন করে যেতে পারে যে ট্রান্স মানুষ কেন হিজড়া পেশায় যায়, কারণ ট্রান্স মানুষকে সেই একটা কাজ দেওয়া হয় না, পলিটিক্যালি সোশ্যালি তাদেরকে ইনভিজিবলাইজ করে রাখা হয়। তো ট্রান্স কিন্তু মুসলিম আছেন, দলিত আছেন, ডান্সার বলে আছেন, অ্যাসিস্টার বলে আছেন, মাইগ্রেন্ট লেবার এবং পরিযায়ী শ্রমিক আছেন, বহু ট্রান্স মানুষ রান্না ডান্সে বিহার, ইউপিতে একটা প্রথা আছে যেখানে বিয়ে বা অন্যান্য কালচারাল প্র্যাকটিসে সেখানে কলকাতা থেকে ট্রান্স মানুষকে হায়ার করে নিয়ে যাওয়া হয়। একটা সময় ছিল যেখানে শুধুমাত্র ট্রান্স বা মহিলাদের নিয়ে যাওয়া হতো, যেখানে সিস মহিলাদের নিয়ে যেত না। এখন ইদানিং কিন্তু সেই ট্রেন্ডটা চেঞ্জ হয়েছে, যেখানে অনেক সিস হেড মহিলারা হেটেরোসেক্সুয়াল বা মহিলারাও কিন্তু সেই প্রফেশনে যাচ্ছেন। তো ট্রান্স কিন্তু একটা বিরাট অঙ্গরাও, ট্রান্স মানে কিন্তু এসএনএস নয়, ট্রান্স অ্যান্ড এসএনএস, এই যে সেক্স যেটা বর্তমানে মেডিকেলে বলা হচ্ছে গ্যাস, মানে জেন্ডার অ্যাফার্মেশন সার্জারি, মানে যেটা ইরানে আয়তনের কোনো সময় হয়েছিল যে একদম রাইটিং অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েশন, যে তুমি মহিলাদের শরীরে পুরুষ নারী হয়ে যাও, তুমি মহিলাদের শরীরে নারী, তুমি পুরুষ হয়ে যাও, বাইনারিতে ঢুকিয়ে দেওয়া। কিন্তু ট্রান্সজেন্ডারের বাইনারি মানে হচ্ছে রূপান্তর কামী, যিনি রূপান্তর বা কে কামনা করছেন, ডিজায়ার করছেন, সেখানে থেকে বেরিয়ে যায়, গিয়ে বাইরে কাজ করে এবং এসে বাড়িতে রোজ ঘুমায়। কিন্তু এই সময় যে কম্পালসারি স্টেট ছিল, তারা বাধ্য হয়ে ট্রান্স মানুষের বাড়িতে থাকতে এবং প্রচন্ড ডোমেস্টিক ভায়োলেন্স বেড়ে গেল। একজন ট্রান্স মানুষ যিনি বাড়ি থেকে বেরিয়ে একটা ফ্ল্যাট কমপ্লেক্সে গিয়ে যে পোশাক তিনি পরেন, পরে কাজে যান, আবার এসে রেগুলার ফ্ল্যাট কমপ্লেক্সে পরিবর্তন করে আসেন। এবং এই সময়টা তিনি চিন্তা যে নারীত্বের যে এক্সপ্রেশন সেটা তিনি খুঁজে পান বা সেটার পারফরমেন্সটা বা ম্যানিফেস্টেশনটা হয়। এবার তিনি কি করবেন, তিনি বাড়িতে বাথরুমে গিয়ে এবার 15 মিনিটের যে অভ্যন্তরে হচ্ছে বাড়ির লোক ওই বাথরুমে গিয়ে ওখানে কাজ করেছি, সেখানে একজন ফ্রান্স আমরা দেখেছি একটা স্টেজও আছে। তো তখন পিরিয়ডে কি হতো, সেই বারোটার সময় একটা বেরিয়ে যেত এবং যে পরবর্তীতে স্টুডিও, সেই স্টুডিওটা খুলে সেখানে সেই যেখানে রয়েছে সাব কালচারাল ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ আর প্যারালাইজ অ্যাবাউটের ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ, সেটাকে আমরা বলি মিল্টি ভাষা, সেখানে সাথে এই ফেমিনিন ক্যারেক্টারটা ওখানে গিয়ে ফেমিনিন ড্রেসটা পড়তো। 1 ঘন্টা she used to look up to the mirror, she used to sing, dance on her own, celebrate her transness, and then she used to আবার জামা কাপড় পরে আবার নিজের টি-শার্ট আর নিজের টুপি পরে আবার শার্ট জামা পরে স্টুডিওতে আবার নিজের বাড়ি চলে আসতো। তো এরকম কেস লাগবে এই ধরনের কোভিড পিরিয়ডে আরেকটা সিরিয়াস, যেটা আমি সিরিয়াস করে ফ্ল্যাগ করতে চাইছি, যে সাংঘাতিক ধরনের মেডিকেল ক্রাইসিসে 10 বছর ধরে আমাদের বেসরকারি কিন্তু আইসোলেটেডটা পরে কোনো মেল ফিমেল ছাড়া অফিসিয়াল গভর্নমেন্ট হসপিটালসে আনার্স করা আসেনি। আমি ট্রান্স একদম গ্রাসরুট ট্রেনিং স্তরে সেবাটারি ট্রান্সলেশন মেডিকেল ক্রাইসিস ডিল করে দিস অনলাইন অ্যাক্টিভিজম, সেখানে আমি দেখেছি যে ডক্টরসরা নিজেরা ইনিশিয়াল করে কেটে সেখানে ট্রান্সজেন্ডার লিখে ইনিশিয়াল করবে ট্রান্সজেন্ডার ওয়ার্ড, যেটা কোভিডের পর একজন ট্রমা টিচার সিগনালে তার টিউবারকুলোসিস হয়েছিল। 6 ঘন্টা যুদ্ধ করার পর মেডিকেল কলেজে নামকরণে বলছেন, মেডিকেল কলেজে লাস্টে তিনি বলছেন, সুপার বলছেন যে যেহেতু ইউনিভার্সিটি করে দেখতে হবে শেষ আমরা ডেট বেড, কারণ ইমাজিন দিস ডেট অফ ডেমোক্রেসি ইটস পার্ট অফ দ্য লিগাল রাইটস। তারপর তাকে বলছে ইউনিভার্সিটি যেহেতু ইউনিভার্সিটি দেখবে, তারপর তাকে ভর্তি করবে, তারপর আমাদের 6 ঘন্টা অ্যাক্টিভিস্ট ইন্টারভেনশনের পর তাকে কোভিড বিরোধী তাকে ভর্তি করা হয়। এবার ট্রান্স মানুষ হতে পারে না, তো বেশিরভাগ ফ্যামিলি থাকছে, তো সেখানে পরিবারের লোক চান, পরিবারের লোক চান ব্যবহার করবে, তো হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ প্রবলেমস এই সময়টা তো ভয়ঙ্কর। এমনিতে ট্রান্স মানুষরা ভয়ে বিস্ফোরণের জন্য গভর্নমেন্ট হসপিটালসে যেতে চায় না, সেই জন্য তাদের জন্য মানুষরা এতটাই ট্রান্সফার হয় যে ট্রান্স নেই ডাক্তারের সরাসরি এইচআইভি পরীক্ষা করিয়ে দেবে, মানে জনগণের এইচআইভি পরে ট্রান্স মানুষের সর্দি হয়, কাশি হয়, পেট খারাপ হয়, শুধু এসটিডি এইচআইভি হয়। তো মানে এই ধরনের বিস্ফোরণের জন্য হসপিটালসে বলেন তো গেস্ট শুরু হবে মেডিকেল স্টাফ, সিস্টার্স, যারা গ্রাউন্ড স্টাফস থেকে মানে ওই গেস্ট থেকে মুক্তি পাওয়ার জন্য এই ট্রান্স মানুষরা মেডিকেল জেনারেলে চলে যায়। Thank you, Maitri. That was very important for me to listen. So for me, the feminist research process is a form of witness. Feminist research is committed to not recreating the oppressive relations we study in the research process. During the research process, we devise our research methods in a way where we try to alter the power relations that we are trying to study. So feminist research wants to mimic feminist justice. So এখানে আমরা traditional sociology research থেকে সরে যাই. We don't believe in the subject-object division. We actually believe in sitting down and listening and talking together and co-analyzing. And from that we write our research. This is something that Gloria Anzaldúa or Sherry Moraga, Chicana feminists would say, theory in flesh. Mangsho theke theory that emanates from your own life experience. All of our lives have a story, many stories. And if you follow your story, you will find themes, you will find power relations, inequities that shape your life. And your story will lead you to writing a mega narrative of something. So I wanted to stay with this story, and I wanted to do justice to this process. So Anurag ji story gulo কয়েকটা story bollo যেখানে somebody is not finding treatment in the hospital during COVID-19, যেখানে বাড়িওয়ালারা বাড়িওয়ালি তাড়িয়ে দিচ্ছে because the person doesn't have rent or is a trans person. We also worked with community members, and there are many trans community members who work as domestic help, who are cook, বাড়িতে রান্না করে। এমন একজন আছেন যিনি আমাদেরকে গল্প বলেছেন যে তিনি বহুদিন ধরে বয়স্ক একটা কাপড়কে টেক কেয়ার করতেন, তার ছেলেমেয়েরাও আসেন না তাদের কাছে, কিন্তু কোভিড এর সময় ছেলেমেয়েরা এসে তাকে তাড়িয়ে দিয়েছে, তিনি থাকতে পারবে না। And she রান্না করতে করতে she had ভাতের মার পরে her stomach got burnt, right? In spite of that she was thrown out. So these were some of the challenges that I was finding. Sure. These were some of the challenges. Sure. Thank you so much. Let me give me 5 minutes. I'll wrap up this portion. So these were some of the challenges that we were finding. But we were always also, so when Anurag and I, we talked over the phone, I had to devise a research method during COVID-19 where we could not meet each other. I could not be a traditional sociologist and do a focus group because IRB Human Research Bureau would not allow me, because I'm putting my research participants at risk. যখন আমি ইন্টারভিউ দিতে পারছি না, আমি মিট করতে পারছি না, what do we do? And similarly, I had friends in Manipur and in Dhaka, as I talked about, who were stranded. So I said, hey, WhatsApp-এ যে গল্পগুলো কালেক্ট হচ্ছে, শেয়ার্ড হচ্ছে, আমরা যে ছবিগুলো তুলছি, because I tried to understand what is a safe space, where are my queer and trans people spending time during the pandemic. So we took those images, those stories, and some of the community members created zines. So এখানে কয়েকটা ছবি আছে জিনের. This zine is from Manipur, from within the Maitai community, Amna, run by Santa Khurai. This zine is run by Shamobhavana in Kolkata. They did a zine. They were working with rainbow rag pickers, they were working with trans community members, Moila Kodai, waste collectors. And these were waste collectors who were stranded in Dhaparmat and were actually in some of the working with removing dead bodies of people. Now we were also getting different stories. One of the stories, as Anurag said, of this person who would walk to their family studio at night and dress up, spend that hour to dress up and look at herself, and she only had that 1 hour, on the basis of which she said she would spend the rest of the 23 hours. So this is very crucial. ও কিন্তু বলছে না যে আমি 23 ঘন্টা বেঁচে আছি 1 ঘন্টার জন্যে, ও বলছে আমি 1 ঘন্টা দিয়ে 23 ঘন্টা কাটিয়ে দিচ্ছি। So how crucial is that hour in life making, that you can get the energy, the very vitality to go through the next 23 hours in life. ও বলছে আমি কোনো মতে 1 ঘন্টার জন্য বেঁচে আছি, আমি কাটাচ্ছি সময়। There was another story that came up that said I asked in Hindi also, "Bhai, आपका lockdown में समय कैसा बीता?" And she said, "बहुत अच्छा बीता भैया." I said, "अच्छा क्या हुआ?" "नहीं, मेरे बॉयफ्रेंड की नौकरी चली गई थी, उसने बहुत टाइम दिया मुझे, बहुत सेक्स किया हम लोगों ने, बहुत खुशी थे हम." So, and that was so important for me to hear. You know, it was a very challenging narrative. It challenged this victim trope. So we wanted to bring out these multiple dimensions and give it a pictorial dimension. Let people see, because seeing is witnessing. So it's a graphic novel to Berobe. This is one story, the migrant trans worker I was talking about from New Delhi, who had to devise her own geography, take a train, go to Agartala, had to perform sexual favors with the border security force, finally to get to Dhaka. Right? So these are narratives. This is from Manipur. This is the story of a Manipuri launder dancer, a Manipuri trans launder dancer and a makeup artist who ends up returning to Manipur. While we also have difficult stories of the quarantine, we also have stories from the same NGO saying many of them own small beauty parlors in Imphal and in Moirang. And what they would do is they would buy beer and cook their own food and shut down the shutter and have a great time inside, right? Enjoy and create a sense of conviviality and intimacy within the pandemic. So what is important is to understand how people who are marginalized, something that your dean talked about, spatially, in the border areas, like literally, or even in the city are marginalized, how those marginalized communities were creating on-the-ground geographies. Remember, আমি বলছিলাম জয়াদির কথা যে she knows exactly কোথায় কোথায় যেতে হবে। অনুরাগ জানে ওর বন্ধুরা কোথায় কোথায় আছে, কোথায় কোথায় রিলিফটা দিতে হবে, যেতে হবে, কে রান্না করে, কোথায় কোন বাড়িতে থাকে, থাকতে পারছে না। এই geography-গুলো, when you are recreating a geography, that is what we call on-the-ground or altered geopolitics. Not the geopolitics of Narendra Modi and Putin and Trump, but it is bodies that have been left bare. When traditional geopolitics fail to provide security to certain bodies, we devise our own geographies to take care of each other, and that is what is called on-the-ground geopolitics or altered geopolitics. So I will leave you with that. Altered geopolitics is a feminist geography concept that at a time of intense precarity, when nation states were closing down borders, even streets, and police was closing down the geography of the street, how trans communities devised their own geographies in order to take care of each other. Thank you. So I hear some of you have to go to a class, and I want to know what class is that. What kind of economics? Wow, welcome, well, congratulations, you made it to college life. Okay, enjoy your class, and then those of you, if you can stay, I would be open to Q&A. Thank you. Sure, yes. Sure. सीमा और क्यों या बच्चे ना तुम कॉलेज से पढ़े एडल्ट Thank you. Thank you to the first years, and I want to say, enjoy your college life. This is the best time of your lives. সত্যি দেখি একটা ফুল দিয়ে আসবো রে যাই ঠিক আছে Sure. So how many of you are sociology? Sociology? Which year? Third year. So it's final year. Second year. What do you want to do with the degree in sociology? Think about it. And master's first year, congratulations. Third year, bachelor's. Very, very crucial time, but it's very exciting time. You're also sociology. Which years? Yeah, we should ask. Yes. We are wondering, Seema, if the university has male, female, and other or trans column, X column available for students. No? Others for me. It's a good beginning. It's a good place to start. Okay, yeah, thoughts, questions, and I'm happy to hear or answer. Yeah, you can pass it around. These are images from the upcoming graphic novel. Take a look, pass it around. This is the draft of the graphic novel. This was the first draft of the graphic novel. So we are condensing the stories and creating a graphic novel format that will be interspersed with some academic writing of mine. So this will come out next year from Punctum Press. So once it's out, I would love to come back with the book and then we can do a book release. Yes. Please tell your name and department. Yeah. Thank you, Chandri. Chandni, thank you, Chandni. So my bachelor's is in sociology. My master's, I have a dual master's in geography and urban planning. and then my PhD is in feminist studies. So if anybody told you changing your mind, being interdisciplinary might not help you get a job, it's not true. I think being interdisciplinary is very important. And sociology and geography for me goes hand in hand. Like what does the geographer ask? The first thing the geographer asks is where. We are interested in the location question. But we study social relations in relationship to a location. And locations are very important because how I can present myself in my gender identity in my house or my office or a park or what time of the day in a park is very different. So space, I mean, খুব easy example is young women are often told রাত্রিবেলা ওই জায়গাটাতে যাবে না এই জায়গাটাতে যাবে না দিনের বেলা ওই জায়গাটাতে যাওয়া safe, right? So we experience our gender and gender identities through space, right? So to partake in intimacy, to partake in lovemaking or intimacy with the partner of your choice, you need a safe space, right? An idea of safe space. So gender relations and sexuality and space is very important, and space actually frames who we are. Right? I mean, one very important thing a trans activist friend of mine in the beginning of the pandemic had said, this idea যে social isolation, don't stay home, stay safe, don't talk or touch anybody. The question was for a trans person, I want the life isolated. A human touch, for a lover's human touch or a general touch for many trans people is actually rare. The way we experience touch often is abusive touch or a touch that corrects your gender presentation. It's something many women also experience, right? I mean, a loving touch is one of the last things as a gendered person you might experience. You might experience somebody stopping you, hence they touch you. You might experience somebody wanting to remove your makeup, and hence they touch you. You might experience somebody telling you, don't go there, or don't drive down that street at that time of the night, or don't wear this kind of clothes, you're going to invite glances. These are forms of touch, both physical and non-physical, that we experience. And that form of touch and isolation is very given in everyday life of many trans community members. Who else is social marginalization? The idea that when you have COVID, you don't want to touch anybody, you have to isolate yourself, right? Nobody can come to you. ছুতে পারবে না, খাবার দিতে পারবে না, বাইরে ছেড়ে যাচ্ছে. This is untouchability. This is something that those experiencing caste oppression know this intimately. So you're remapping certain practices and calling it for the safety of the public, which is important. But these experiences are not new experiences. Some people, fortunately or unfortunately, experience it on an everyday basis. So অচ্ছুতের আমার মা আমাকে বলছিল কোভিড হয়েছে আর আমরা অচ্ছুতের মতো দরজা বন্ধ করে বসে আছি. And I said, don't say this is a joke. It's not a joke. There are people who are still considered to be ọচ্ছুত, and we practice these forms of caste inequality, right? So first, epistemologically, I have to think of this intersection, right? What does that intersection mean in an everyday basis, right? Then I had to, as a researcher who is from, when I call myself after Umanarayan, 1/3 foot in the 1 foot in the 1/3 world and 1 foot in the 2/3 world. Mane Fortress America ekta pa ar Bharatbarsha ekta pa. Right? That's how I live my life. So, but that's a very privileged position. Not everybody gets to live their lives like that. So, as a privileged researcher, it was very important for me to listen to how these intersections were being experienced, to narrate it, to hold it up in front of everybody, but also to empower communities while we are doing the research. So Anurag, for example, had discussion groups at her house. The zines we made were made with community inputs. The graphic novel will go to the community first for input about the graphics, about the dialogues, in order to ensure if their lives are being represented correctly or not. Secondly, to meet with policymakers, devise intervention in a way where policymakers are engaged, and you're engaging, your knowledge has a public output, public facing knowledge. So our academic journal pore kar jiban bachbe, kintu if I can help through the research process, an organization do a town hall where we present the data, we present the stories, impact communities. That is very important part of sociology. The sociology is also doing. It's about doing sociology. It's not just narrative sociology, right? Sociology is also, it was devised, what was the invitation to sociological imagination? Anybody read that essay? An Invitation to Sociology by Peter L. Berger. Look it up, it's a very good essay. An Invitation to Sociology, Peter L. Berger said, this is a way of unmasking power inequities in society. So if my research is driven towards that, then very important is to also think how my research is being presented. Who gets to see my research? Who gets to read my research? Why a graphic novel? I will reach way many more people than an academic journal. The story of trans communities during the pandemic needs to be read in order to be to understand and create empathy in people's lives, right? So, and that is one step towards shifting power relations. So a research methodology that imagines within the research process steps or processes that that might alter the very power relation I'm trying to study. So first, I want to highlight a very important distinction that is there in feminist epistemology, is that we are committed to ending the power relations that we are studying, not mimicking it. So I don't show up with a note khata and say, "Ha bolun apnar jibone ki ki kharap hoyeche, acha thank you, note niye gelam, apnake 100 টাকা দিয়ে গেলাম, খুব ধন্যবাদ, এবার আমার বইটা বেরিয়ে গেল, আমার খুব নাম হয়ে গেল।" ভালো কথা, কিন্তু মানুষটার জীবনে কি হলো? So a research process that engages with the community, we all work with limitations, সবকিছু করা সম্ভব না, but you have to figure out what you can do in the process. Secondly, I think in terms of intersectional research, and a very important aspect is reflexivity. As a researcher, I have to ask myself, who am I? I identify as genderqueer, both she or he pronouns, but clearly I'm presenting myself as a man. I hold a US citizenship. I come from dominant caste background, historically dominant caste background, and a middle class English-speaking privilege. So it's very important for me to remember my privileges, because it is only when I remember my privileges I will be open to intersectional sample, to remember to always ask myself, did I speak with Dalit people? Have I thought this project through the lens of a Dalit trans person? Have I thought this project through the lens of a trans man who's not here? The stories over here are predominantly trans women, predominantly city or periphery-based trans women. There are some trans male narratives here. So it's very important to ask these questions, not that we would be able to solve everything. We are not magicians. I mean, one thing to remember is I'm a sociologist, I'm not Mother Teresa. আমি সবাইকে বাঁচাতে পারবো না। So the question, সেও পারেনি অবশ্য, but পারবো না সবাইকে বাঁচাতে। So the thing is, but to be very clear and to set your research with those limitations in mind. Chandni also talked about law in society, and so law is in our everyday. Law is something, what let me ask you, when I say law, what comes to your mind? Rules, okay. What else? Yeah.
Transgender is created man to women to make by some gender organ, sexual organ transplantation. That is the first thing. And that is how much man is converted to women, trans women, and how much women is converted to trans women. That is the point. And the second point is during the time of COVID, there is a blood is a very important media for this COVID transmission. So during that time, how much percent is converted to this thing?
Okay, we can come to that. I mean, I don't think COVID was transmitted through blood. It was actually really transmitted through spit and orally through air. So it wasn't actually COVID dies in human blood if it is being transmitted through blood to blood. But we can talk about the trans. So the idea that surgery is the only means through which we identify trans is not true. It's only a US-centric, Eurocentric idea of transgender. This idea of gender affirmation procedure, যেটাকে আমরা বলি gender affirmation procedure, as in accessing surgery, skin, hair removal, hormones, we call them soma-technological services. This is happening only in the 1950s, 1960s, mostly in Europe and mostly in America, and predominantly among upper-class white trans people. So the term transgender does not signify simply gender affirmation procedure. Rather, the term transgender signifies multiple forms of gender identities, including Hijra, Kinnar, Jobappal, Aravani, Methi, Maithilis, travestis in Brazil and Argentina. So you might not actually be using any form of soma-technological. It is really based on my psychological identity. I feel gender is psychological. I feel I am a woman. Doesn't necessarily have to do with the organs that I am born with. But to go back to the question of about others, let me come to the question of law. When I say law, what comes to your mind? So I heard rules. What else? Justice. Limitations of, okay. এখানে সব ফিলসফার খুব অ্যাবস্ট্রাক্ট কথা বলছে, রুল, জাস্টিস, লিমিটেশন, গুড, বাট ল বলতে প্রথমে কি আসে আমাদের মাথায়? কোর্ট, ওকে, গুড. জুডিশিয়ারি সিস্টেম, civil servants, the constitution, police, penalties, but who gives those penalties? Often it's the police, no? So, okay, good. These are institutions, legal, judiciary, executive, legislative branches that create constitution frameworks through which we live in a state of state. We don't live in a state of nature. We live in a state of state. But law doesn't just exist. Somebody said rules. Rules doesn't just exist through judiciary or in a book. Rules are also experienced. Rules are also interpreted. How one judge interprets one constitutional provision versus how another judge will interpret that same constitutional provision will be very different. How one bench of justices will give you one kind of review of a judgment would be very different from another bench of justices, right? So law বলে কোনো একটা জিনিস নেই। দ্বিতীয়ত হচ্ছে, ঠিক আছে, কোর্টের ল কনস্টিটিউশনে লেখা আছে, খুব ভালো কথা, কিন্তু আমার জন্য ইন্টারপ্রেট করে হচ্ছে কে সে কনস্টিটিউশনাল লটা? যেদিনকে পুলিশ অফিসার, it could be the police officer. There is a reason why when they show their hand, traffic has to stop, because we have socially accepted that this person has a common power to stop us, just like the street light, right? But who is interpreting the law for us, right? NALSA judgment, National Legal Services Authority versus the State of India, 2014, we get a decision that says every Indian citizen has the right, based on their self-affirmed gender identity, to access gender identity-based ID cards. Great. And then gives directions to the state and national government that you make provisions, hey government, you make provisions about ameliorating poverty among this community because it's an important part of the community. Well and good. But at an everyday basis, when I show up at my Aadhaar office and say, Dada, amar M na, F na, amar O chai, she will be, I'm to China, এটা কি করে করতে হয়, আমাকে তো কেউ ট্রেনিং দেয়নি. Literally, in my field work, I actually have a very funny story. I'm going to share that. This is in 2017 when Narendra Modi needed our ID, Aadhaar card, PAN card, our phones to be all connected. And so 3 of my friends needed their Aadhaar card to have their gender identity changed, right? And they had already changed on their Madhyamik and Ucha Madhyamik certificates their gender identity and name and all that. So they said, please come with us. কারণ যদি বদমাইশি করে তাহলে তুমি চেঁচামেচি করবে, আর তুমি যদি খুব ইংলিশে চেঁচামেচি করো তাহলে হয়তো কাজ হয়ে যেতে পারে. So I said, okay, being an ally, যদি আমাকে এই রোলটাই প্লে করতে হয়, I will play. Sometimes you have to do that, right? So we showed up at this Aadhaar card office, and first of all, you know this, Aadhaar is block or like address based, right? So when you go to get your Aadhaar card, that office usually tomar parar mashi pishirao dariye achen. So your gender is on display by people who are already policing and surveilling you on an everyday basis. So I realized that because I showed up and one of my friends said, "Isho mashita o didita esche bishon jala amake jano to chotobela theke jaliyece." And I was like, okay, so your gender is literally on public display. Imagine an office, an entire neighborhood trying to decipher your gender. How would you and I feel? Right? Something as intimate, as deeply related to your own sense of self is being questioned by others constantly. And right there you need that person to change your identity records. And there are not only a person who's sitting in front of a laptop who's maintaining the database, but there are people in the line who have been surveilling you since you were a child, right? How painful is that process, right? So we get to the line and we get to the person, and the person says, oh, transistor sisters, acha. না মানে ট্রানজিস্টরদের কেসটা আমি ঠিক জানি না, আগে 2 দিন আগে একজন এসেছিল, রমাদি করেছে, রমাদি এখন নাচে গেছে, আপনারা বসুন, রমাদি আসবে করে দেবে. So my friends were really angry. They were like, ট্রানজিস্টর না, কতটা ট্রান্সজেন্ডার. ভদ্রলোক আমাকে কাছমাছি করে বলছে, হ্যাঁ দাদা বুঝতে পেরেছি, কিন্তু শুনুন না, ট্রানজিস্টরদেরকে তো অনেক ল দিয়েছে, মানে কিন্তু কি দিয়েছে আমি ঠিক জানি না, আমাকে তো ট্রেনিং দেয়নি, রমাদি করে দিচ্ছে ট্রানজিস্টরদেরকে. In the meantime, the 2 or 3 mashi species in the line, like, দিয়ে যাও না, ওকে ছোটবেলা থেকে দেখেছি, একবার মেয়ে বলে, একবার ছেলে বলে, লাইনে দাঁড়িয়ে আছি, দেরি হয়ে যাচ্ছি, বাড়ি গিয়ে খাবার গরম করতে হবে. This whole commotion is playing out, and he stands up and he says, wait, আমাদের এখানে 3 জন ট্রানজিস্টর সিস্টার এসছে, ওদেরকে হেল্প না করে আপনাদেরকে হেল্প করতে পারবো না. So at that point I realized he's not necessarily being transphobic, he just doesn't know, right? So we waited for the Ramadi to come, who came and who huffed and puffed, and he's like, Ramadi, যে ট্রানজিস্টর সিস্টাররা এসছে, আপনি একটু হেল্প করে দেবেন. And Ramadi said, কথা বলছি, ওরা ট্রানজিস্টর নয়. And like finally somebody would correct him, and she goes, ওরা transformers. At that point, right now, we were like laughing, and my friends were like, শুনুন, ট্রানজিস্টর ট্রান্সফর্মার যাচ্ছে বলুন, এটা চেঞ্জ করে দিন আমাকে. Now this chaotic commotion, I actually had a paper in mind, wait, the transistors are here. This chaotic commotion, this confusion of categories, transistor, transformer, it like reveals for you, what does it reveal for me as a researcher at that moment? That the term transgender is absolutely new for the Indian everyday person. Very true. এবার তিনি জানেন কিছু একটা হয়েছে, হ্যাঁ স্যার ট্রানজিস্টার জন্য ল হয়েছে, কিন্তু কি হচ্ছে আমি জানি না। সো ফর দ্যাট ডে তুমি যদি তোমার আইডি চেঞ্জ করাতে যাও, দ্যাট পারসন ইজ দ্য ল ফর ইউ, দ্যাট পারসন ইজ দ্য স্টেট। দ্যার ইজ নো দ্য স্টেট, মানে আমরা ভাবি পার্লামেন্ট স্টেট, নরেন্দ্র মোদী স্টেট, বাট দ্যাটস অ্যাবস্ট্রাক্ট। এভরি ডে আমার পুলিশ অফিসার, আমার যে লোকাল বিডিও অফিসার, বিএলআর এ যদি আমি ট্যাক্স রেকর্ড তুলতে যাই, দ্যাট পার্সন সে বসে আছে, এবার ল এন্ড বিহোল্ড তার সঙ্গে খুব বাজে মুড, ইউ গেট আ রং স্টেট দ্যাট ডে, right? So that is the state. So law and society, we have to think about law through the lens of society. Like, how does law operate? Who operates and operationalizes law? Who interprets law for us, right? It's not just the police, but it's other people. Sorry, I've kind of gone on and on, but I wanted to give that example as a story. একটা বিষয় আছে শেষে, যে কোভিডের সময় আমি যখন একদম ফিল্ডে কাজ করছি আমরা, তখন একটা জিনিস দেখেছি যে যত আমার ট্রান্স মানুষ কোভিডে মারা গেছে বা কোভিড হয়েছে, তার থেকে অনেক বেশি কিন্তু তারা সাইকোলজিক্যালি অনেক ড্রেন্ড হয়ে গেছে, যেটা স্যার বলছেন যে টাচ, মানে ট্রান্স মানুষরা তো সারাক্ষণ একটা ডিনারে থাকে, মানে থেকে তারা অপমানিত, কাজের জায়গায় অসম্মানিত, রাস্তায় পিপল গিভিং ক্যাট কজ, তো একটা ইন্টার কমিউনিটি যে সলিডারিটি থাকে, মানে ওই জন্য ট্রান্স মানুষরা অনেক বেশি বদলে, মানে একে অপরকে হাত করে নিজেদের মধ্যে, যে স্পর্শটা বাবা মা ভাই বোন, যে হিউম্যান টাচটা নতুন ফ্যামিলি থেকে পাওয়া, সেটা আমাদের ইন্টারনাল একটা সিস্টেমের ব্রাদারহুড ফ্যামিলি একটা ট্রান্স আছে, সেখানে চাই যে একে অপরকে ছুঁয়ে হাত করে। আর এইটার ক্ষেত্রে আমি দেখেছি অদ্ভুত একটা পর থেকে একটা যে মুখ্য পলিটিক্স, দ্য ফিলোসফি অ্যান্ড পলিটিক্স অফ ডেথ, এই যে যেটা মৃত্যু এই যে মৃত্যু ডিজায়ার ফর ডেথটা অনেক বেড়ে গেছে। মানে আমার কোভিড হওয়ার আগে তো আমি যদি রাখা হয় আমার বন্ধু বান্ধবদের সাথে, আমি একটা ছোট্ট এক্সাম্পল দিচ্ছি যে আমি যে আমার স্পেসে ছিলাম, যেটা একটা জায়গায় ক্যাম্পেশন ছিলাম ওই একটা শর্ট পিরিয়ড, তো তার মধ্যে যেখানে ছিলাম টক্সিক, তো প্রায় 8 ঘন্টা প্রচন্ড নিজের সার্ভাইভাল, নিজের মেন্টালিটি ঠিক রাখার জন্য আমি সারাক্ষণ ছাদে ঘুরতে না কমিউনিটি পার্সনস activists, with my friends, আমি ওইটা আমার সার্ভাইভাল মেকানিজম, আমি নিজে বাঁচার জন্য আমি এটা করতাম, পড়ে যাচ্ছে, ফসকা পড়ে যাচ্ছে, মানে ট্রান্স মানুষের একটা সেলফ ডিস্ট্রাকটিভ মুড, যে বাঁচার বাঁচার ইচ্ছা থাকে না, মানে নিজে কানেক্ট করার পর থেকেই যেভাবে তারা সেক্সুয়ালি, ইমোশনালি, ফিজিক্যালি, মেন্টালি যেভাবে তারা ডিপ্রাইভড, প্রফেশনালি কাজের জায়গায়। কিন্তু আরেকটা জায়গায় একটু বোঝাবো যে এই যে ট্রান্স মানুষটা একটা হোমোজেনিয়াস কমিউনিটি, ট্রান্স নন-বাইনারি আছে, ট্রান্স মেল আছে, ফিমেল আছে, masculine, feminine person আছে, সেখানে ট্রান্সদের মধ্যেও তার একটু সিম্পটমস আছে যে আমি একটা সুন্দর সেশন পেয়ে করবো, একটা সেশন পেয়ে করবো, আমি প্রফেসরের সাথে পেয়ে করবো, কিন্তু এই প্রেজেন্ট পিরিয়ডে যেটা রয়েছে সেখানে কিন্তু একটা ডিক্লাসিফিকেশন রয়েছে, সেখানে কিন্তু একটা ডিক্লাসিফিকেশন রয়েছে। আমি কাজ করতে গিয়ে দেখেছি প্রচুর অ্যাসোসিয়েশন তৈরি হয়েছে, মানে প্রচন্ড সিচুয়েশন এখানে কিন্তু একটা And that's actually very important to understand what we call COVID intimacies. And think about in your own lives, how our socialization pattern had changed. One of the other things, one of the stories that came, it was very similar stories from Kolkata, this particular story, যে পাড়ার দাদারা বসে থাকতো, যারা খুব আওয়াজ দিত, চিৎকিরি মারতো, এবার মানে আমিও বসে আছি সন্ধ্যেবেলা রকে, because there's nothing much to do, you just step out for a little bit and you go back, and you formed a friendship with the same people who actually were engaged in catcalling you. There were some, and the other was dogs or pets, like parar kukurder jonno bhat baniye diyechi, and one of them said, the dog listened to me, knows everything about my life, and was my sense of like belonging and beche thakar icche je oke kalkeo khawate hobe. These forms of intimacies were very important for me. I didn't want to read them as a lack. Like, because I do not have other forms of intimacy, I wanted to read them as life-making, as joy. That it is very important how trans people create joy in the barest of the situation. Manipur, you are in a military-occupied zone where even accessing HIV medication, some of the stories were where even accessing HIV medication required you showing your passport, your identity to go between bus stops, from Moirang to Imphal to get your medication. This 50-kilometer distance is like going through national borders, right? You're actually going through army checkposts. So this form of bareness, in that one of the stories that came was this trans person, genderqueer person. She was very older. She was very happy with her garden. And she spent a lot of time gardening. And she sent pictures of her garden to us, that her garden was her heaven of rest, And so these are very, vitality is very important, because vitality is what biopower, sovereign power tries to tap into. Capitalism can tell us, you feel very joyous about it, or you watch a Vicky Kaushal movie. I did watch Bad News. Has anybody watched Bad News? No, acha. It's actually quite interesting from a feminist perspective. But these are not necessarily the vitalities. Vitalities come from touch, from each other, from interspecies contact. And it was really important for me to understand how vitality was being created. The limitation of law is that law doesn't give us life. Law might give us a framework for upholding the rights of life, but law doesn't give us life. It's other human beings. It's access to resources. It's other animals. It's nature that provides a context for joyful living. Anything else? Thank you. I just want to say that it's very special for me anytime a sociology department invites me. I never say no because I studied sociology myself, and as I said, sociology is very exciting a discipline. You can do funky, funny things with it. When we were studying sociology, somebody wrote a book on Amitabh Bachchan, and we were like, what, a sociologist can write a book about Amitabh Bachchan? So we were like, what is that about, you know? And so it is really about what makes Amitabh Bachchan Mr. Bachchan, right? What is it about gender and masculinity and his presentation and the film and power and all of that? So these days there are so many exciting new dimensions, the virtual being very another important place. Run with it, have fun with it, you know. Sociology is very special to me. Thank you.